Hello, and welcome back to Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds, the podcast of the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. I'm Alex.
And I'm Rachel.
And today we are going to do a book review. And the book is called Origin, A Genetic History of the Americas by Jennifer Raff. And I first heard of Jennifer Raff on numerous podcasts where she had this interesting statement that the genetics or the DNA of ancient people was way ahead of the archaeology. And I was very confused or interested by this. And she finally wrote a book, which I thought is a very good book. And both Rachel and I have read it, and here are our viewpoints on the book.
So, like any good reference book that is for the layperson, when you are talking about a very technical approach, the first couple chapters in this book are really, really fascinating because it goes into all of the terrible lack of consideration for the indigenous populations whose ancestors the early remains were. So she starts talking about the earliest outset of physical anthropology, of archaeology, of how, of course, this discipline developed, but didn't really develop with respect to the people whose ancestors these were. So, this is really a frightening look into exactly how flawed scientific development was at the time. There's a large section on essentially what's only one step up from phrenology, where basically the debunked theory that the shape of your skull is dependent on race and forms the basis of this idea that your skull shape determines your personality. And it's a lot of flawed results. So early on, she's going over the discussion of how physical anthropology really developed. And one of the major players in physical anthropology, one of the fathers of physical anthropology, Raff actually quotes Herdlisha in saying, quote, "Strange how scientific work strengthens everything," unquote, which is really just the basis of this whole section of white scientists thinking that they know better than indigenous cultures as to what these remains of their ancestors mean, what these people actually meant to the descendant communities. And then also Hayes, one of the early archaeologists that Raff talks about, especially during the plundering of burial mounds, just completely doesn't care about the skeletal remains. So we're talking about the early 20th century where there's essentially no scientific rigor. There's no methodology. Or there is a methodology, but it's only to get to the grave goods, not caring about the bones or even the people themselves. So there's a lot of quite haphazard scholarship early on that led to a lot of the problems that we're seeing today with the indigenous cultures with the indigenous people, that there's a lack of trust with the scientific community. And these early chapters are really, really important. It sounds just like a historiography of the foundation of physical anthropology, but really, Raff is explaining why it is so very important, why we have to look to the descendant communities and understand that these are ancestors for them. So we're talking about basically the shame of how much of the early research was that the research that a lot of our modern physical anthropology and archaeology relies on, that how much of it was just utterly barbaric morally and scientifically. And this is something we don't learn in class necessarily, something that is just taken as, oh yes, do we learn about Hayes? Do we learn about who Herdlisha was? Yes, we do. But do we know what they were doing, or do we look at them from a lens of the native perspective? No. So it was very eye-opening. I really appreciated how detailed she goes into this section. But it also really can't be denied that, again, this unfortunate style of research was a massive springboard for understanding that the indigenous perspective is very important. So, for example, she talks about this one chapter about how the old Museum of the American Indian was just basically cases and cases of things that some were on display, no regard to the people that it comes from, doesn't matter who it belonged to. But when you juxtapose that with the current National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian, with the incredible respect and descendant community engagement, it really can't be denied how important these early chapters are in explaining just how far we've come with understanding of what respect is and what basically cultural significance is, other than essentially, the early tomb raiding by white men. that was for a very long time exactly what archaeology was.
And an example of this, which she gives, which is very appropriate for this area, is Thomas Jefferson. Um, and I forget the year he started doing this. Near Monticello is an Indian mound, and he called this an Indian mound. And he began to look into it and figure out what was its use for. And he started to dig into this mound. And you get the good Jefferson, the scientific Jefferson, who is making detailed notes, recording what he's finding, analyzing how it was built, and realizing this was built by native populations. And at the same time, you have the bad Jefferson, who has a complete disregard for the skeletons that he's in finding. The fact that he's not informing any of the native groups that he is digging in, and obviously an important burial ground to them. There was no regard to keeping them or reburying them. Come to find out, this is a Monacan Indian mound, and pretty much Jefferson did destroy this while trying to understand and look at what was going on here. So again, you have this scientific method of looking at it, analyzing it, thinking about it, writing about it. And again, this complete disregard for the subject matter, the people he's finding, and actually the skeletons that he is finding here. And so it's a very interesting concept. One of the things that Jefferson does, again, going back to the good Jefferson, and this is why Jefferson is such a compelling figure because he's all over the map on every single thing. And Jennifer Raff points this out in his book, is he's one of the first people to speculate that Indians are Asian or maybe Asian and Siberian and somehow crossed over, basically breaking the land bridge, which we will soon know as Beringia, um, thousands of years ago. His timing was all wrong because, again, they're stuck in the time where they think everything is revolving around how old the earth is. And by biblical measures, it's about 6,000 years. But Jefferson is the first one thinking along these lines. Jefferson, from his analytical mind, sort of got a lot of the story right, but his methods really were atrocious.
And that's kind of what Raff is talking about in the majority of these early chapters about just how very flawed and very subjective some of these techniques were. For example, let's go back to the advent of craniometry, where again, only one step up from phrenology, where the shape and dimensions of your skull determine your personality, or for example, if one was so called inclined to criminality, things like that. And this can very swiftly become a matter of seeing what you want to see when you're taking these measurements. You can basically create any sort of typology, and typological rankings can really cause a lot of problems. And that's what we start to see in the late 18th and into the 19th century with the advent of these groupings by type, especially when we're talking about not just stone tools, not just pottery, when we start talking about the shape of people's skulls and bones. So you can group as many ways as you want to. We call them, basically groupers or splitters, where you can subjectively create your own categories based on what you want to prove. If you're really not careful, or if you're being extra selective in your sample, selectively sample, essentially doing bad science. But it's not necessarily scientifically sound as we understand it today, of course, but this kind of provides a better sense of understanding as to why so many of the racial stereotypes started to come out from the scientific community, particularly in regards to where the first Americans came from. And Raff makes a great point that Native Americans really caused scientists a lot of great stress because they weren't mentioned in the Bible early on. So they just couldn't comprehend where they were coming from. That this population that apparently springs out of nowhere on a continent that has no contact with any of the so-called biblical people, it caused great consternation. So there was trying to connect the evidence to basically the biblical beliefs, but also essentially the racial stereotypes thereof. And then if you read the measurements, what's called so-called the Mongoloid, which of course leads them to be classified into one of Carolus Linnaeus's four groupings or four types of humanity, which really led quite early on to the idea of Asiatic migration. So Carolus Linnaeus, of course, coming out about the same time as Jefferson, this idea of taxonomies and understanding how we can group these, again, taxonomy is essentially like typologies as well, based on your appearance. But one of the most fascinating things along with this in this book is that it's okay. You start off with the history of physical anthropology, and scientific development is, to be frank, very racist in this case. So very racist findings. So what I'm going to go with is one of those shocking statements that every student of anthropology actually learns. First of all, is that race isn't real. But, however, as Raff points out, race is a real cultural phenomenon. It's unfortunately embedded in our social structures. It's reflected quite heavily in the early scientific communities. But scientifically, race does not exist. And this is where we start getting into the DNA and why understanding of DNA has expanded our horizons immensely. Because 99.9% of all human DNA across the board is the same. The little bit that's left over, as Raff points out, that they're the bits that control the phenotype or the physical expressions of the DNA. And these are things that are influenced by outside phenomena like the environment, the climate your ancestors lived in, or even generational access to nutrition. So, for example, with the Inuit, the shovel shaped incisors that are so very, very critical early on in these typologies of understanding that, oh, these shovel shaped incisors, the teeth that we don't understand an actual function for, but we can identify them as early Native American. That's phenotypical, basically from that tiny little 0.1% of the DNA that's left over because it was adaptational. It doesn't mean they're not human. So once we start seeing understanding the DNA that way, it's really just opens up all of these ideas about that it's not enough to account for difference to set these groups of people apart from each other. Humanity is humanity. There's just a very superficial level of what you're seeing being a separate group just because of where they lived or what they're eating or what they're doing. And you don't see these across the board necessarily either. So it's absolutely demoralizing to realize just how the scientific community has aided and abetted this current climate of discrimination and bigotry that exists because of racial terms solely derived from physical appearance and solely understood from an early scientific understanding. So, this selective science that allowed for anyone other than so called Caucasian to be considered inferior, and this idea that's been lingering and it's now been picked up and used by hate groups today. And then these hate groups become more and more mainstream as technology improves and they have access, they have more of a platform to reach a bigger audience. As Raff says, basically in the conclusion to these first 3 chapters, is that science has a lot to answer for.
But now we're going to jump to the second part of the book, which deals with the question, where did the first people of the Americas come from and when did they come? And she kind of settles on the term first people rather than any other group of natives who are living here because she is going back to the very first people into the Americas. And it's where it gets very, very confusing and very, very interesting.
So, what I really love about paleoarchaeology and this sense of deep time is it is the sense of deep time that my research focused largely on the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, largely in Northern Europe, which seems a very long time ago to us if we're looking at it in relation to the present. But thinking about it, so 1200 to about 300 BCE, it's not really that long ago if you're looking at it in comparison to this deep sense of the first peoples of the Americas 13 to 30,000 years ago.
And another way to look at this, which I was surprised when someone was mentioning this to me the other day, look at 1,000 years as 30 generations. And so if you go back 20,000 years, that is 600 generations. No one can figure out who your ancestors were 600 generations ago.
Which is why these oral histories, these oral traditions of descendant communities are so very, very important, really, because they can tell us things that science can't. And they're very important to these descendant communities. They are a foundation of where they came from. That's their origin stories. We need to respect that as well, even when science can't support them or can't tell us anything about them. This is their story.
And really, the story really goes back even further than what we're talking about probably to 36 to 46,000 years ago. And that is when people are moving into Asia or East Asia. And that is critical. Um, and it seems, looking at the DNA, and this is something that this is ancient DNA, and this does not necessarily mean um, DNA from the first people. This is ancient DNA from the Asians, that a group of East Asians gets isolated early on, about 36,000 years ago, from the rest of the East Asians. And it seems this is a climate change where they might be going north. And there is a chance, and again, this is very speculative, as they're going north, they're going to come into contact with what they call the ancient Siberians. And this is a group, and this again, it gets very confusing when you're looking at the DNA, who the people are, but this might be a group that small percentages of them and this isolated East Asian groups come together, mingle into what is basically a continent called Beringia. And up to really a few years ago, Beringia was just called the land bridge between Asia and Alaska, which is how the first people would have crossed over. But it's twice the size of Texas. It is a continent, and it seems that this is where a group of people lived. Again, this is all speculative. The DNA seems to show this, but the archaeology, because most of this is underwater, does not show any of this.
So, as we're talking about the archaeology, the really fascinating thing about trying to find the first peoples of the America and a sense of time for this, make a timeline with the archaeology, is these are migratory people. They are going to be nomadic hunter gatherers. They're not making big settlement sites. So, we're lucky if we find a burial or if we find technology. Technology is really the big one. So, this is where we get into a lot of heated scientific debate. So, we're talking stone tools, we're talking lithic technologies. And of course, early on, it was just at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century was the Folsom Point, found in the Southwest. So, this Folsom Point, obviously not a modern or a more modern style of post contact native technology. It was found along with some megafauna. Eventually, was actually found very much with in context with megafauna, so you can date it that way. Then there was the Clovis Point. The Clovis Point being still kind of the sticking point where nothing could exist before Clovis. Clovis had to be the earliest. So really, the thing about the Clovis Point is that one, you see them kind of across the board. You see them in all sorts of contexts. You see them across the continent, really, and there's this idea that maybe the earliest appearance of Clovis is about 13,200 years ago. So we're still talking a very deep sense of time, but it still beats out the Folsom Point. So we can tell it's definitely before the Folsom Point. And then we come to the pre-Clovis argument.
Well, this is where I'm going to date myself. When I was in college, it was just Clovis. There was no pre-Clovis, and everyone thought that when the corridor, the ice-free corridor, opened up around 13,000 years ago, that is what brought the first people into North America and then eventually South America, and they were all Clovis. But interestingly, when Rachel went to college, she happened to be on a team that decided to change all that. Let me rephrase that. They didn't decide to change it. They found something that proved that Clovis was wrong.
Okay, so you're dating me a little bit too early there. What happened is that I happened to be lucky enough to study under the first finder of a pre-Clovis point. So when Dr. James Adovazio was running his field school for, I believe he was still at the University of Pittsburgh at that point, out of the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in the border of Pennsylvania and West Virginia. So this rock shelter, they found a point that did not look like Clovis, and definitely with all the layers predated Clovis. And it's caused a lot of controversy. So when Doc published his findings, it was immediate that, oh no, we've already solved this. Clovis is Clovis. Clovis is the beginning. This must be some sort of contamination of a site. And that argument stuck around for a very long time for quite a few of the anything that was pre-Clovis, anything that could be dated, even securely dated to before 13,200 years ago, was denied that, oh, it's contamination, no, it's poor methodology. And poor Doc has really, I mean, that's been his life's work to argue against this. That no, this is a securely dated site. Then other sites cropped up too. We've got so Monteverde in Chile. We've got um, other sites. We've got the Page Ladson site in Florida, that's underwater. We've got Paisley Caves in Oregon, and Buttermilk Creek in Texas. There are some in Wisconsin. There's Cactus Hill in Virginia. They're all over the country. They're all over the Americas. Relatively securely dated sites that these points are not Clovis. They are made differently. They are within stratigraphy that is very datable and doesn't have any contamination. That was the big thing about Meadowcroft, was that, oh, well, it's so close to, their outcrops of coal. Well, no, the furthest coal is too far away to have leached and changed the radiocarbon dating. But there's this idea of essentially, well, we've solved it. We know when the first people had to be here, and we can't argue against it because why would we change it? It's kind of lazy scholarship that, one, we're defending our pet theories to the teeth, but also why would we look beyond what we already know? Which again, not the way scientific work should work. Challenging a new idea, yes. But when that many sites pile up, it gets aggressive. And actually, Jennifer Raff points out the fact that reading some of the commentary about Meadowcroft early on gets really uncomfortable. There's basically personal attacks that come out because scientists, just like everyone else, once they think they know something, they're very happy to keep that idea. But science is never like that, especially archaeology, especially the study of DNA, especially physical anthropology. We have theories, we don't have laws, so everything can change.
And now it gets even more interesting because a few years ago, just when Jennifer Raff is writing this book, in White Sands, New Mexico, in the national park, or actually just outside of the national park, they come across some footsteps. And these are footsteps of obviously of a family. It seems to be small children and parents who are walking in it very near to where giant sloth pits are. And they started to figure out doing the layers above where the footprints came and the layers underneath and doing careful analysis, came up with a date of 23,000 years ago, which would put people in North America before the extent of the last glacial maximum, where there couldn't be movement back and forth. This is mind boggling. To me, it might not be to other people, but I'm absolutely fascinated by this. The next thing, and this did not make it into the book because it just came out, is in Peru. They came across some giant sloth bones. They're made into tear-shaped pendants made from bony materials from the sloths, and these are personal objects for human beings. And they dated this, where they found this giant sloth to be between 25 to 27,000 years ago. So all of a sudden, there seems to be more evidence that maybe people were here a lot longer than people ever imagined. And it gets to a series of questions and theories, or I shouldn't say theories, I should say hypotheses on how this all ties into the same story. This is what I took away from the book because it got me to be thinking a great deal about movement, how people move, and the possibility of how people can move using boats, just going along the coastal routes, which now know are all underwater. So it's going to be very hard to prove these.
So that's really where we come to next. Notice how we are not even touching the DNA yet. We haven't really hit the DNA. We're still talking about the archaeological evidence. So it's really fascinating how all of this pairs in. It's such an interdisciplinary tangle to talk about earliest peopling of the Americas because we have the DNA evidence, which some people don't accept yet or might be contaminated. It's still a new science. We're still feeling it out. But then we also have the archaeology where there again, people get addicted to their pet theories and they fight for anything that might say naysay their pet theories. But if we're talking about the essentially the kelp highway opening up, So this explains why, remember, I just mentioned Monteverde down in Chile. Monteverde dates to about 14,000 years ago. So definitely pre-Clovis, very close to Clovis time. Well, 1,000 years before. All the way down in Chile, we're talking about people coming from Asia, coming from East Asia. So going up north, coming across the Siberian landscape, across Beringia, down through Alaska and the west coast of what's North America. How do we get down to Chile? And that's where the boat theory comes in. So the archaeology really starts supporting these ideas. And the Kelp Highway, really, I mean, it makes sense. Why would you walk across desert land, across land that has ice, that has dangerous megafauna on it, when you can just hop in a boat and scoot on down the coast and save your time eating everything that the sea gives you and making really good time going to somewhere that is going to actually be more isolated and much more useful for you instead of walking all the way down the coast, which is relatively impossible and would change the dates by a lot.
Now, this is interesting because Rachel and I have two different viewpoints of this. I'm more of a layperson. I do not have an archaeology degree or an advanced degree. So I was looking at this, as someone who's just very interested and very interested in how people move and move about and how settlements occur. And when you start reading about the DNA, it gets very confusing because they start looking at different lines and trying to trace different lines to the origins or where it diverges from another different group as it comes across. And from the understanding of this, she was breaking this down into when you look at it, there are sort of like three groups of people that sort of end up in Beringia, and she calls them ancient Beringians. And these are people who don't actually move. They stay in Alaska. As Beringia disappears, this is a group that stays in Alaska. Then she talks about the ancestral Native Americans. This is the group that will become the first people. So these are the people that move. And then interestingly, she talks about two lines, and sometimes it's known as population A and sometimes it's known as population Y. They're distinct markers in some of the ancient DNA they have found, and there's not a lot of DNA they have. There's not a lot of people that they have. This is really from about 13 or 14 cases that they're looking and analyzing, um, and finding out that there's a small subset of a group that they just don't understand, which leads to the hypothesis of how people move. And on like the population Y, is this the group that made it before the last glacier maximum? And then the ancestral Native Americans who will become the first people or more numerous come after the last glacier maximum? And is there some mix in of these two groups? And if there is, and there probably is, because it seems to, of all places, shows up in the Amazon Native people. And it is really interesting to wrap your mind around all of these different subsets. And there are multiple waves. That is a wave we are talking about. There is another wave that comes much later, which are really the Arctic people, the Inuit, who are going to be settling above the Arctic Circle and eventually go into Greenland. Then there is another group which diverges from the groups that came down, which are going to settle into the Caribbean, which are slightly different than the groups who would be on basically what is the mainland United States. So it is a very fascinating story.
So what you're looking at for the most part is when you really get down to the DNA of it is the easiest way to trace it is hopefully to find mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA comes from your mother's line. Your all the siblings have it from the mother. Doesn't matter if you're male or female. Your dad has it from his mom. All of your uncles would have it. All of your aunts would have it from that same maternal line. So it traces down. And of course, tracing the maternal line tends to give you a little bit more secure population tracing because you can definitely tell who your mother is. That's one thing that's kind of obvious is that you can trace down through the pregnancy, but then you can also trace backwards. Where did mom come from? Where did mom's mom come from? So on and so forth. So once the discovery of mitochondrial DNA came out, that made DNA basically declensions very easily. Not very easy, but it made it more clear. So when we're talking about the divergence of these clades, the different groupings, when we actually look at how populations diverge. Those are called cladograms, and we have the clades. So we can, again, see these divergences as we're extracting various DNA from various dates. So it's not just, oh, we've found we found Kennewick man, let's take his DNA and we know exactly what happened. No, it's a build upon the sample. It's a building up of the population to be able to do these compare and contrasts of the DNA and understand where these lines are coming from and how things or populations are diverging and when they're diverging with the dates of these samples. So it does get very complicated. But the one thing I really adore in this book is how much Jennifer Raff stresses that we do not have the right to the DNA of the ancestral people of North America. The descendant communities have the right to that DNA. We do not have the right to modern indigenous DNA. And this is where, again, building off of the horrors of the first chapters of how barbaric and how invasive the early science was, and even how early on with DNA in the 20th century, how universities could cover up. Oh, we were just taking your DNA for this study to help you understand your ancestral processes, and then using the DNA turn around for something else, or using the blood sample to engage in essentially slightly racist studies that have nothing to do and had no permissions given. Explicit permission is one thing that she stresses very much, and I really appreciate how well she does that in this book, while talking about the DNA, while talking about scientific processes, while talking about all the advancements, but understanding that this is the history of a living people, and that the living people have the right to be understood or not by the wider scientific community.
And lastly, one of the things that for me that shows up in this book is really how small the world is that there's an example of two teeth that were found in Siberia. These are ancient Siberians. And when they look at the DNA from those two teeth, they found out they were two boys. They were not related. So that means it's coming from a bigger population. And generally, from my understanding of this, is that that group sort of has disappeared. The people who were the ancestral Siberians. But from that group, there was movement, and some of them went westward towards Europe, and some of them went eastwards, which will eventually be to Thuringia and eventually North America and South America. And so it's not that Native Americans have a common ancestor with Europeans, but both Europeans and Native Americans, humanity started the same, that there is a connection there where an ancient group that has sort of disappeared, sort of has a little bit of their bloodlines in Europeans and a little bit in Native Americans. It's also where she shows that this population Y that she talks about also shows up in Austrian Asian people. And it's not because, and she debunks this right away, it's not because the Pacific people are coming and settling in South America. That was a debate that was going on before. But early on, like 40,000 years ago, there are some ancestors of both of those people. One went one way, one went the other way. And somehow there is a connection between those two that shows up very faintly in their DNA. But it shows you how we really are all one and the same.
And quickly back to that, the idea of no race and yet still being respectful of essentially indigenous proprietary rights to their own person, that becomes a cultural aspect. Colonizers have done such horrible things to indigenous populations across the board and essentially attempted to destroy their culture, that these are the direct descendants of these first people we're tracking back. People who colonized North America later diverged so much further back that cannot claim central ancestry. Just like not everyone can say that I was going to use Genghis Khan, but yes, most people can actually claim distant relations with Genghis Khan. But not everyone is necessarily related to certain royalty, and everyone's related to certain celebrities of history. That there are descent lines, and everyone has their own right to understand their own ancestry, but also to not let anyone else know that as well. So it's not a question of race; it's a question of respect. And especially not treading where we're not wanted, because oral traditions, cultural oral traditions of a lot of these indigenous people, they have their own value. They are just as valuable, if not more, than tracking back and finding the genetic delineation of where these people came from and who they might be related to, because that might not be the way their culture views it. That might not be the way their culture wants to view it. They have a firm understanding of where they came from that they accept. We don't have the right to force that upon them just because of science. Science is not a magic word. But the last thing I really want to talk about is how much I appreciate in her book is when she's talking about a specific set of remains, how she oftentimes gives a little imaginatory fictional story of how did these remains end up where they are. And it really pieces it together. It gives that sense of humanity back to the ancient people we're talking about instead of just giving them specimen numbers. For example, when she's talking about the Anzac site in Montana, it's a 2-year-old burial that's much earlier on than a much later descendant community who buries their older boy. I think he's about 6 to 8 years old, who was a descendant of the same family, was the same group, but they're separated by 2,000 years. So it's again, the way she posits it in there, it gives a face to the remains that are being studied. These are people. These were people. They were living at one time. We can't just treat them as science has a tendency to of these are your source material. They deserve just as much respect as more modern burials.
Well, as you can see, we both like the book a great deal. We highly recommend it. It's one of the best books I've read in a long time. It makes you think. I read it twice because I read it a long time ago and then I had just read it a few days ago. And it's amazing how much I forgot the first time I read it. So it's not only a book I recommend you read once, I recommend you read it twice.
So if you're interested at all in the incredibly well-written, incredibly engaging synopsis of where our understanding of the first peopling of America and where people are coming from, where they're going to, how they come across and start living on the Americas, highly recommend Origin by Jennifer Raff.
Thank you very much.